I want to welcome everyone to today's webinar. I'll say good morning from my side in Vancouver, Canada. Good afternoon, good evening to those that are in other parts of the world. My name is Kirk Paris, and I'm the Advisor Education at the Commonwealth of Learning, and I'll be chairing today's webinar. As you'll see from the screen share here, it's entitled Blockchain and Gaming in Education, part of our webinar series. Today's specific presentation, Bridging the Virtual with Real-World Application. This is about gaming in education, and we're fortunate to have two presenters from the University of Malta Institute of Digital Games, Dr. Stefano Gualeni, and Dr. Voulgari. We're fortunate also to have with us a facilitator, Dr. Alex Grech. We'll both be sort of managing on the back end, but Alex will be the main facilitator, and just a few housekeeping issues as well. Your mics are silenced, as you probably have been participants in other webinars, but we encourage people to post questions, comments in the chat room or in the Q&A, preferably the Q&A, but some people do not put the questions in the chat. But by all means, pose questions at your leisure. The way we'll structure this is that we'll have two presentations, first from Stefano, which will be a video recording, and that will be about 24 minutes. After that, we'll take questions and answers. But of course, continue to pose your questions as the discussion unfolds. The second presentation will be by Iro, which will be about 20 minutes. So we've got a lot of time. We've booked an hour and a half, so we can finalize also to have, or sort of wrap up the last portion of the webinar with a Q&A discussion. So we look forward to your active participation. I've got here as well that the session will be recorded. It will be put up on our YouTube channel and the YouTube channel for Alex's organization, the Center for Connected Learning, which he'll speak to in a moment. There's the email addresses for all of us. Jasper, I think Alex will introduce Jasper. He's helping us out on the support side. But of course, if you have any questions, follow-ups, things like that, there's our emails. I'll post those again in the chat, and I'll show them again at the end of today's presentation. So without further ado, I'll defer to Alex. He'll also speak a little bit about the concept of the webinar series and introduce our panelists, and then we'll get started. Over to you, Alex.
Thanks, Kirk. This is a session I'm particularly looking forward to because as far as I'm concerned, it really takes me out of my comfort zone. The idea for the emerging technology series really first started along the lines of blockchain decentralization, self-sovereign identities, and peering into the future. And partly by accident, because I got to know Jasper as we were looking at something obscure called the Internet Society, as it happens, and whether we could have a chapter in Malta or not. But even more so, I think in these COVID days, watching my 17-year-old son trapped during COVID days with exams delayed and trying to keep sane, inevitably at a fixed period of time, it might even be happening now, Jacob will be with his friends playing digital games, and the games they will play are, I've seen strategy games, I've seen pure aggression games when they're literally, I think, as boys, mainly trying to keep sane, I think. I've seen thinking games. And I've always found that as a 59-year-old almost, in 2 weeks' time, it's something which passed me by. And I really feel this generational divide sometimes. And for us, for people like me as educators, and I teach new media in my other job, I guess. It's something that I've always felt was a lacuna in my education, and yet it's something I'm really fascinated by. So that is really, but it was almost like one of those light bulb moments that when I said, "Gosh, we need to get these guys," and we're looking at a world-class institute, and that's how this kind of this webinar took its place in this emerging technology series. Okay, so I want to talk to you about the center. I think you vaguely know what we do. I work very closely with Kirk And as we're all saying, we're all now in uncharted territory because of COVID, post-COVID, and the rest of it. So I'm really very, very interested to see how we're all going to learn a bit about this. I think Kirk explained, I think Jasper is in charge of running the two videos. So first, I think we'll run Stefano's video, and then we can, please, post whatever questions you have in the chat box, Q&As or whatever it is. And we can, Stefano can take some questions then. Then we'll run Ero's. Ero is in Greece at the moment, so if you have to think of where we are, so you've got Vancouver, Greece, and people in Malta right now. And the rest will unravel, I hope. So on that basis, I think let's go for it. So Jasper, if you can share the first video.
Greetings, everyone. My name is Professor Stefano Gualeni, and this is A Telescope for the Mind. The title of this talk is not originally mine. In fact, it comes from Margaret Masterman, who is a British linguist, who used it as the title of one of her 1962 article on the Times Literary Supplement. In that article, titled A Telescope for the Mind, she compared the potential of computers to transform our conception of the world to the invention of the telescope in the 17th century. Galileo's invention in that period not only advanced and spurred more scientific research and new knowledge in fields such as optics or geography or astronomy, but also it was momentous in terms of changing the minds of the people of that period, for example, concerning the centrality of planet Earth in the universe or the role of religion in social life. Similarly, I'm going to discuss the computer as, again, a telescope, something that can be used, and of course it led to great advancements in a number of fields, including scientific ones or the automation of tasks, but also as an instrument, a technological device that led to profound changes in the humanities, the human sciences, in the ways that we understand and portray ourselves and relate to one another. So I'm going to focus in particular in that telescopic function of computer in its possibility to disclose the interactive experience of virtual worlds. When I talk about virtual worlds or virtual technologies, I'm not uniquely referring to virtual reality, but more broadly to a variety of technologies that disclose what we mean or what we normally call worlds. By that I mean that whenever something is persistently perceivable, non-actual and interactable with in a way that is meaningful, that, according to a philosophical current called phenomenology, that sets up an experiential world. And it doesn't quite matter whether it's experienced on a screen, through a visor, whether it's playful or serious, whether it's in first person or third person. All of those are indifferently understood as virtual worlds of different kinds. And about me, who am I to talk to you about these things? My name is Stefano. I have a PhD in philosophy. I was a game designer, and I deal with game studies and game design at the University of Malta at the Institute of Digital Games. Just a few notes about myself. As I said, I used to be a game designer in the industry. I've worked there for about 12 to 15 years, depending on how we calculate it. I released about 12 commercial titles. And then, as some friends of mine would say, I wasted it all to get a PhD in philosophy and start an academic career. Only I don't see it that way. To me, the creation and the study of virtual world is really crucial to philosophy, at least to nowadays philosophy. through the creation and the analysis of virtual worlds, we can, in a way, redigest our philosophical past, apply and reshape new and old notions, and give rise perhaps to new perspectives and maybe better questions that are only, and they're uniquely possible, to be asked and maybe to be answered through the digital medium. So to me, what is happening now with computation is particularly interesting from a philosophical point of view. Okay? Should you be interested in furthering these ideas in particular, there are two books, two monographic volumes that are published. You can see them on screen right now, which in a way condense and further develop knowledge that was generated in fields such as game studies, virtual worlds research, philosophy of technology, and so on and so forth. So if you want to go deeper into these topics, these two books should be exactly what you're looking for. But let's get started. So how do we look at the experience of virtual worlds and virtual worlds as technical artifacts as, in a way, portals, gateways to disclose the experience of virtual worlds, and what effects do they bring about? Since you are listening to this video and you're probably participating to a webinar somewhere, I suppose that you're already kind of, in a way, convinced that digital technology has a positive and potentially very fruitful impact in education. What you should know already, or should already have an inkling about, is that virtual worlds are transformative in many ways, many more than I'm going to be discussing today. For example, if you're into education or serious gaming, you already, I'm sure, treat computer games or virtual worlds or interactive simulations as capable of communicating notion and teaching certain preferred procedures in fields like education and training, very institutional fields. Take, for example, the following. Video games and digital simulations can be used, for example, to simulate delicate surgical procedure or medical operations without putting the patient's life at risk, especially when you as a user are in training for these kind of things. Similarly, we can talk about flying simulator, which can put the pilot in particularly dangerous or risky conditions that, well, they're better experienced in simulations first before them being encountered in the actual world. Both these procedures will help, of course, limit the damage and still produce relevant knowledge for the trainee in question. In class, games are used to stimulate questions or to impart notions concerning history, historical figures, architecture, archaeology, and so on and so forth. I mean, I could mention several examples, but this is precisely not the topic of this talk. So this is something that you perhaps should already know about, since it's been the case in 15 years. And many European events and grants and, well, forms of investment, both cultural and financial, rotate around the persuasive and instructive possibilities of interactive worlds. So what am I going to talk about instead? So beyond their use already institutionalized in education and training, virtual worlds can be used to challenge dominant cultural discourse and promote critical thinking. What I mean is that they can reveal other forms of being, different perspectives. They can put into question our, in a way, established assumptions and beliefs about something. So they can put into question the knowledge that we already have or we already think we have. A particularly good example of these kind of games or these kind of virtual worlds is offered by Cart Life by Richard Hoffmeyer. In this game, the designer presents the player not with a power fantasy, not with a problem that eventually can be solved if resources and actions are optimized to a certain degree, but rather to the repetitive, tedious, and occasionally, if not ever, hopeless role of an immigrant or an otherwise disenfranchised person who needs to make a living in the United States, often without a social security support, kind of. So is this game fun? Well, no, not particularly, precisely because it challenges the notion of what a game traditionally is in terms of the expectations that the players have when facing a game. And at the same time, it proposes a critical view of how invisible and how poorly discussed and how poorly catered for disenfranchised and marginalized people are in the American society, within the American society, of course. Another great example of similar games are The Parable of the Polygons by Nikki Case. In this game, she reveals how, by a financial and statistical means, these events, and I'm talking about segregation and gentrification of urban areas, come to be. And those kind of things are in a way taught and communicated to the players, not by means of traditional media, such as, I don't know, video or text, something that is also used in education, but rather through playful interaction and internalizing interactive information. It's quite a great thing, and it indeed changes your mind with regard to how you think about social disparity and homogenization of social groups. Another great and famous game in this regard when it comes to politics and propaganda is the McDonald's video game by Molindustria. The game puts the player in the role of manager of the McDonald's corporation, and the implicit goal of the game is that of keeping the corporation going, keeping it in business. The player will quickly realize that in order to do so, many questionable activities will need to be accepted and done, including lowering the wages of your low-level staff, or deforesting the Amazon to make room for soy plantation, and so on and so forth, serving sick cows even when that should not be allowed, and so on and so forth. So if you are interested, whoever is watching this webinar lecture, or your student, in understanding political rhetorics in video games and how interaction might be set up for you to fail and to take the, let's say, the evil side of the discussion, this is a great example that I recommend you to check. So in a way, the negativity of the whole functioning and the need to stay alive is part of the rhetorical message proposed by the designers in this particular game. And of course, I do not mean to use rhetoric or rhetorical in a pejorative sense. What I mean to say is that the developers, Molindustria, certainly used interaction and in-game possibilities to inherently and experientially reveal a certain point of view, which is normally critical of what has been done until now, or pointing the attention of the player onto aspects of our society and our politics that are not necessarily inclusive, fair, viable, or ideologically sound. Ian Bogost called these kind of games persuasive games, and the mechanics, the logics underneath it, procedural rhetorics. But let's go back to our point. Virtual worlds can be transformative in many ways, as we've seen. They can be institutionally used as tools for education and training. They can be used as countercultural, expressive, usually related to artistic movements, tools to promote critical thinking or to criticize certain socio-political decisions or attitudes. And finally, they can be used as tools for thinking. They can disclose experiences and interactions to think with. They are, in other words, or they have, rather, the possibility to be treated as interactive thought experiments. But before I give you some examples of how digital worlds can be used as, in a way, tools for thinking with, I might mention that there's another little possible use of virtual technology and video games, which is to perceive things otherwise, to go beyond human perception. This is also a bit of a thought experiment, but I'm not going to go too deep into it. But for example, if you ever wondered what happens to time and space and geometry if you, as an active, let's say, entity in the universe, approach the speed of light, there's a game that allows you to, in a way, experientially familiarize with this kind of relativistic changes to our experience that could happen. So instead of necessarily being a physics major and instead of having the capability to calculate those kind of modification and transformations yourself, there's a game-like experiment that allows players to progressively slow down the time of light and experiencing the world as almost as a photon. What does it mean? What would it mean for me to turn back? Why does geometry all skew and light is weird? And yeah, it's a very interesting, in a way, thought experiment, but again, has to do with perception rather than thinking. Another example I worked on is a game called Harvest, which tries to put the players into a situation where they have desires and perceptions that are similar to those of a bat. So the game could be like a thought experiment about what it is like to be a bat in response to the very famous question by Thomas Nagel. He's a philosopher that famously inquired about whether we could ever understand what it is like to be for a bat to be a bat. A puzzle platformer game called Migakure by Mark ten Bosch asks the player to start reasoning in 4 spatial dimensions instead of 3. So at that point, we would need to be successful and to be able to play this game correctly, we would need to be able to reason in 5 dimensions, right? So 4 spatial ones plus time, as opposed to the 4 that we traditionally live by. In a way, pushing our brain to think and perceive the world and geometry in space in ways that are different from how we perceive it as biological creatures in our everyday relationship with the actual world. And I could even talk about the work of my friend Alan Hook, who uses computers and computation and cameras and virtual reality to provide the let's call it the player, for lack of a better term, the experience of what animals feel like from a perceptual point of view. So to get closer to them by mimicking very closely their point of view, the way they see light, color, the way they perceive smells and hearing, and so on and so forth. But this is not where I'm going at. I'm going to talk more specifically about thought experiment from a conceptual point of view. So thought experiments in philosophy are tools that we use to think with. And they normally are used to stimulate intuition and reveal ambiguities and contradiction in the way we believe something, we justify our beliefs, we articulate our thought and orient our moral compass. There are indeed many thought experiments that are about the morality of something. You might have heard about that more recently than not, with the idea of self-driving cars, right? And about the hypothetical scenarios that are created for the player or the user or the future user to make decisions about what the car that they want to drive should behave like in terms of a certain ethical scenario. The one I'm talking about now was designed by myself, and it's called something something soup something, and in a way it replicates a thought experiment by this Austrian philosopher Ludwig Wittgenstein. In a way, the game takes place in the future, in a futuristic kitchen. Only the kitchen is no longer in use. Why? Because humanity invented teleportation, which is that kind of teal-looking machine on the back of the picture. So the kitchen is no longer in use, but we use teleportation to, instead of liberating humanity by oppressing aliens. In fact, it turns out it's way cheaper to build food on an alien planet and then have it teleported to Earth rather than producing food directly on our planet. The problem arises, though, when we figure out that aliens don't have a clear idea of what food looks like for us. In particular, in this game, we are ordering soup in a soup kitchen, meaning that we're asking aliens to produce soups, but they don't have a clear idea what they look like. So in the game, we take the role of a server who needs to decide whether what they produced, these aliens, are actual soups that can be served to humans. And during play, the player is exposed to a number of different soups and possibilities with different kind of cutlery, containers, ingredients, thickness, and so on and so forth. And the player can decide by pushing left or right whether that would be a viable soup or that should be discarded. This is what a discarding of a soup looks like. In this case, the soup was served in a coconut, and it was frozen with rice and carrots. So one of the questions that the game implicitly asks is, does it need to be a liquid? And what can it contain? What can it be served with? The game proposes like many soups, about 20 per play session, evaluating different categories of thinking. So the player, in a way, by picking soups to be served or not, are revealing their beliefs about soups. And soups can be very weird. Yeah. At the end of the experience, the game gives back a reasoned definition of what soup could be based on the decisions made within the game. So not only it questions their players' understanding of what a soup is during gameplay, but also confronts them with a final synthesis of their own decision. Can the game be won? Well, no, because what it does is like challenge you and then in a way like spit back to the player whatever you put into the game in terms of decisions. The game is freely available on a website which you can reach from the previous one, the one I told you at the beginning of the talk. But it is interesting that the website, and I do the same thing with all my little game and thought experiments and so on and so forth, come with a bunch of publications and video and explanation. So what I'm trying to get at is that if we decide to use video games and virtual worlds as tools for the humanities, for thinking through, for debunking ideologies and so on and so forth, it does not mean that we understand them as, in a way, exclusive new tools or the fabulous panacea of all the problems in the human sciences. Rather, it's a new way of expressing that allows for certain particular things to work much better than text, and other things much worse than text. What I'm trying to say here is that it is an addition to an arsenal for thinking and expressing, and not the final ultimate answer to what philosophy needed to do. This non-exclusivity of the digital medium is also explored in another paper of mine, but that's not super important. The important thing is that you get the message, and the message is it's a great, powerful tool. It's like a telescope for the mind. It doesn't mean that the telescope is all you're gonna ever be using. There's going to be still other tools that you use to explore the cosmos and yourselves and the situations you're in and the ethics you live by. So more papers and games of this kind you can find in, well, actually on my website. If you click either paper or games, there's tags on top of that. And well, I hope that I managed to convince you that we can, and actually we already are largely using virtual worlds as social tools, even when we do not know it. So since they're going to influence the way in which we think, we operate in schools, and we communicate and express ourselves, my point here is that we should try to get or develop awareness and knowledge about how they operate and what the possibilities are, and what virtual worlds and simulation are particularly good at, and what they're particularly not good at and should be not used in certain other fields. So what I'm trying to say is, like, since they're already a important and constitutive aspect of how we develop culture, self-knowledge and relationships with others, we might as well invest in studying what they do from a number of different perspectives. So those two aspects in blue were, to me, the central ones to this talk, because they're hardly ever discussed outside of academia, and I think you should become aware that this is a thing. And again, in case you want to delve more and deeper into these topics, let me recommend you these two books, which were written precisely with that scope. That said, I thank you, and if you want to follow my academic adventures, you can use Twitter. Thank you very much, and I hope this was clear and helpful. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Stefano. Thank you to the recording of Stefano. I think it was really some interesting sort of, you could see certainly the philosophical, your background coming out fully in your perceptions and conceptualization of game design. I'm going to just...
I wish I could give you more examples and go into more depth, but as I told you, I didn't know what kind of audience we would have. So I just scratched the surface by saying, hey, look, we've been doing the humanities for centuries using 2 or 3 media forms. Yeah. What happens if we add this one?
Yeah.
And if you want to know more about it, I'm here with questions, because I mean, I've been developing games and writing about it for about a decade. And so, of course, I could give the audience more than what I presented here, which was little more than an introduction dressed like a sort of very bizarre personal plug, which I realize now it was a lot of my work in my papers, but yeah, I didn't mean it that way. There's other people doing a great job, and if you ask me, I can give you some indication. And most of the games that I mentioned, if not all, are developed within the context of academia and are free. So some of my friends use the games that me and other people did to explain philosophical point or to question some ethical decisions in class, because they tend to be very short, very accessible and free. So that's another little thing. If in class you have a web browser, you can run these games as sort of class activities, which lead to discussions afterwards. For example, realizing that you don't quite know what soup is, and this concept might be sort of actually a family of concepts that you don't share with, say, your classmates, might lead to some realizations about the use of language and the way in which you categorize and relate to the world. So as I'm saying, I'm not the only one doing so, but in general, what you will find is short, accessible, and playable in class, so as to facilitate discussion or to be quickly analyzed and to, in a way, support other activities that can happen during a class or a lecture. Sorry for interrupting you, Kirk.
No, that's fine. Thanks for the that overview. I was going to actually gesture to Alex if you had any pressing questions that you wanted to pose to Stefano.
I've got a lot of observations, and I'm not sure they're questions, but one of them was actually, Stefano, are you an outlier? Are there people like you who crashed from philosophy and got into gaming? Because, yeah, so that's, yeah. And the second thing,
let's start with one, Alex, so we can just do it quickly. Consider that the Institute here, several of us take a humanities perspective and apply it to games. And we belong to, among others, we are affiliated with a community called the Philosophy of Computer Games community. Not many of them do next to think about digital media. So not many of them produce examples or tools to think with. But the idea that those tools can shape our minds and they can be aids in the way in which we think about problems and relationships and philosophical questions is quite well established. So I'm one of, say, 70 to 90 people in Europe doing similar things. Okay, sorry.
The questions I want to ask, and I got plenty, but I don't want to hog this, because the first thing which came to mind when you said telescope for the mind, I mean, it took me back to probably 10 years ago. I had done a course with somebody called Howard Rheingold, who's one of the fathers of the internet, okay? And the course was called Mind Amplifiers. And he was looking at games. He was an artist, but he was also, as an educator, which is what he's been all his life, he was finding text increasingly ineffective as a way of getting across to people. So having written books, he could see that people were using mobile devices. Okay, so he went through things like, he's got a book called Smart Mobs. He was realizing that people were using mobiles as a secret code with which to communicate. And then I think those of us who are parents get into the Minecraft, you know, kind of, that's our first interaction, I think, of people my age, okay? And I think there's always this tension, I think, from people saying, and I think I saw somewhere, I think there was a comment, you know, about children spending almost like too much time in front of screens. You know, is this all a waste of time or not a waste of time? And you taking us to the other kind of side of the scale by talking about philosophy and games. And I'm just wondering how we're going to bridge between your world, my world, which is a bit closer to yours because of the philosophy side and the new media side, but potentially the frustration of people who have been locked up with kids for the last 4 months or 5 months because of COVID and going nuts because the only way that kids have survived is looking at the screen. So I don't know how you would react to this crazy observation, maybe.
Well, I mean, your question contains 3 kind of questions, because it's both about the use of media and the use of media in this particular context, and also you as a parent and your concerns. So it's a very intricate knot. I think perhaps the most interesting bit of your question, and I don't want to take too much time from Iro, so I'm going to pick the question that I liked the most. I hope you're not sorry about that. How do we transition from treating games as something to pass the time or to do a bunch of other things to treating them as serious cultural artifacts? The point is that we already do. Only how the telescopes that we use right now work, kind of very, very focused on one single thing. Think about it. Games like Minecraft, Uncharted, I mean, any games, the shooters that you play, tend to have very, very similar ideological setups, which is, it is good for you to acquire resources and to optimize your behavior. Even if you don't want to, that is a particular mindset that is particularly conducive to capitalism and current society. So even if you do not want to, and you think that these tools are ideologically and philosophically neutral, they're still exposed to philosophical notions. Only they're not particularly desirable ones, in which the strong person needs to become the strongest, winning is paramountly important, accumulation of wealth is king. So if that is the kind of values that children are exposed to, then I understand your concerns. Maybe too much time spent there might function like an indoctrination. But as to the question, like, how do we pass from believing that games are entertainment and the games are philosophy? I'm telling you, it's clear that they are philosophy even when they send a stupid message. Only it's stupid philosophy. We just need to figure out that we can say better things and we can train ourselves to think differently, also with the use of the same kind of tools, and not just use them as like distraction or repetition of, think about it. If you're a game designer or a game developer, the same mechanics of accumulation, high score, winner takes it all, blah, 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 tend to be like repeated to nausea in many of the games we play commercially. But you start to see in the past 10, 15 years, games with different values starting to emerge. Games for social inclusion, games meant to explain how politics work, games for sharing knowledge and games for sharing wealth, as opposed to games to accumulate wealth. So my point, and I'll conclude here, sorry for that, is that we already are using them as indoctrination, only we're doing it stupidly with a very, very closed mind. What if we pick a better telescope than the one that's only looking at how to make more money and how to get us away from daily problems, and use a telescope that instead like highlights these problems, suggests solution, and let us test and play with alternatives, ways of organization, of thinking, of relating to one another. So I think this is my point. We're already doing this. We just need to focus it a little better.
There are I think what I'm going to do is, I'm going to take the 3 questions. I don't know whether they just chuck them on you. And so from Shami, I can see, do you see game and virtual worlds being used to teach, say, history because history is very boring? Can it be the mainstream as tools or medium of education? What would be needed? That's one, okay? And
it's the one I will probably forget about it. So let's take Shami's one.
Let's do this one, yeah?
Well, there's a degree of difficulty there because you know that games, the way we figure them right now, are about interaction and success. However, the historical process is not always as sanitized or successful or pleasant to go through. Let me make you a classical example. If we were to learn about the history of Anna, the story and the history related to Anna Frank's diary, for example, player interaction might get Anna or her context to behave in a way that doesn't respect the historical facticity of it, meaning that perhaps in this context, games and interactions might not be the best and most respectful and perhaps the most critical way to look at things. However, we could work with speculations or we could use other media. What I'm trying to say is that perhaps interaction, and I said that in my talk, interactions are not necessarily the ultimate solution to all our educational issues. It's something that you can mix and, for example, decide absolutely not to use in some contexts. Some historical tragedy I don't think fit very well with the interaction and the playfulness and the possibility even to just repeat and replay, you know, that comes with a trivialization of a certain event, right? In video games, it doesn't really matter if you die, you can retry as many times as you want. And that, in a way, belittles the historical tragedy of the life of Anne Frank. Am I making sense here? So something comes with interaction, which is also a triviality and the opening up of possibility, which was perhaps not the case in the situation that Anna has to face. So it needs to be taken with a grain of salt. Shami, you might find a right context when this could be used, for example, to speculate about the future or to reconstruct a possibility of the past that we don't know yet. But in very tragic and very well-documented situations, interactions might, in a way, work like a double-edged sword. So it's a very good question. And there's a lot of people working, for example, aiding the museum representation and the museum exhibitions with interactive bits. But it needs to be done tastefully and understanding what the medium is doing with making certain information interactive and playful. It's not always a neutral tool that can be applied to anything in this world, right?
Look, this is where my job becomes complicated because this is what normally happens. Like when somebody asks a question, then people start to make, come in with more, even more interesting questions. I mean, from Alan Smith saying history and games are my specialty. Thank you. I should have asked that question myself. Okay.
Well, maybe he should have answered this question instead of me. I'm taking like a very sort of philosophy of technology point of view, but perhaps for an historian, he sees potential that I haven't considered. I'm just saying it's very awkward and it might be sort of trivializing. So it needs to be done with a degree of tact and in a particularly well-informed manner. Maybe certain things work very well with playful interactions. I would say that the majority of it might be hard to replicate or become stupid and perhaps get trivialized by interactions.
Let me talk about bridges, okay? And I'm aware of time, okay? So for example, Emma Ponsford. Emma's somebody who I'm working with and Kirk is working with at the moment because we're preparing for a MOOC on critical media literacies. So digital media, new media, and how to use that, okay? So Emma's saying, how do we bridge the gap between your work, your and Ira's work, and that of the group you mentioned, and the use of gamification in the edtech industry, which sometimes feels gimmicky to people. That is something I'm really interested in because in a way, here's an experiment, okay? So I'm coming from one particular discipline and to other people, how do you mix these things up? And in a way, how do you get people to bridge for the common public good, isn't it? Which I think is the common glue between a lot of people here.
Maybe we should ask her this question, but from my perspective, you mentioned things like gamification and perhaps in Malta, I don't know if you know, but for example, gambling is a great business and a booming business. And they use more or less the same kind of technologies and roughly the same base knowledge as game design in general. The only problem here is that you said a key word for the public good. I think that both gambling and gamification tend to exploit sort of cognitive biases and weaknesses or particular attachment to accumulation of points, getting achievements. So if not done, again, with a certain thoughtful attitude and with respect towards the user, it might become a sort of a patronizing technology capable of normally vehicling behaviors which are not good for you, such as repeating a task that has long become boring and or spend your real money on something that you don't actually need. So again, I would look at gamification and gambling with a it a bit of detachment, because despite being part of the same, largely the same use of technology, they tend not to do what I was trying to explain with this presentation, which is reveal cognitive bias, make you more curious, and make you like put into question certain points of view and certain attitudes that you had towards the world, but rather implant certain beliefs and certain reward system that obfuscate why you do things and how things could be. Right? They channel you into a particular kind of behavior, including gamification that was done for good. First wave gamification was very, very similar to gambling. We would be using sort of reward system to get you trained to do tasks that you wouldn't probably care very much about. Would that stimulus be removed? So again, they are very related technologies, but what we're trying to do in philosophy and video games is trying to instead make you more critical, make you more self-aware, make you ask the right questions, as opposed to, in a way, adapt and adopt behaviors. So I think I'm a bit critical, because living in Malta, you know, like we're often associated with that kind of reality. So gamification and gambling are things that we're often asked to take part in or to join forces with, but we need to be careful. We're coming from the humanities, and we pursue humanities goals. Most of what they're trying to do is they're pursuing efficiency goals, and they do not always go hand in hand. So sometimes we're worried about it. Of course, gamification can be used for good, and there's a number of great and thoughtful ways to do it. But generally, the at least first wave gamification was using very cursive kind of reward and punish behavioral systems, and I would be a bit skeptical about that.
Let me, I'm going to run through this. I'm not even sure.
Alex, I wonder, just for sake of time, maybe we can shift to Eero.
Okay, let's shift to Eero.
Hello, my name is Eero. I work in the area of digital games and game-based learning. The title of my presentation today is Digital Games as Tools for Learning, which is a bit generic because I wanted to see the framework within which game-based learning can be implemented. So let me share my presentation. So, digital games as tool for learning. Over the past decades, there has been extensive research and educational practice focusing on the potential of digital games as learning tools. The discussion has shifted from whether or not we should use games on how to design good games for learning and how they could be best used. Games have been shown to improve skills and competencies, such as understanding of content knowledge in areas such as physics, mathematics, biology, history. There is more engagement with the content, students feel more motivated, and they remember the content better. But beyond motivation and knowledge acquisition, games can support higher order thinking skills, such as critical thinking, decision-making, problem-solving, analyzing and synthesizing information. Players solve problems that are meaningful to them in the context of the game. They don't just solve a puzzle to get the points, but they build a bridge to cross a river and continue their quest. They make decisions that change their path in the game, sometimes ethical decisions, where there is no right or wrong. And each option, each decision has its own negative and positive consequences. They don't. They can explore the game. They can experiment. They interact with other people and other resources and construct the new knowledge following principles of constructivist learning theories and social learning theories such as situated learning, problem-based learning, and exploratory learning. They can be creative and build new worlds, with Minecraft being an example. Social skills can also be supported through digital games. There are, of course, multiplayer games where players can form teams, they communicate, they cooperate and coordinate in order to succeed in the game. But even in single-player games, they may take up roles and see things from the perspective of their character. They may play a character who has depression, like in the game Elude, who is autistic, who lives in an abusive environment, a civilian who is trying to survive in a bombed city, like in the game This War of Mine, or a historical figure. And by playing this role, they are immersed in the situation and they see and act from a different viewpoint and understand the context within which the character acts and makes decisions. Actually, the game This War of Mine was added recently to the official school reading list in Poland for students studying sociology, ethics, philosophy, and history, which is great news. Games seem to have the potential to link the game experience with a wider social and global context by strengthening the students' scientific identities and awareness of real-world problems. By strengthening their scientific identities, supporting civic engagement, civic discourse and participation, and raising awareness of social issues. For example, the citizen science crowdsourcing games, Foldit and iWire, where players come together to solve science problems by playing, by identifying patterns of proteins, or mapping the neurons and synapses of the brain. Foldit has actually released recently new coronavirus puzzles, where players design antiviral proteins to help researchers discover new antiviral drugs. Itch.io, back in June, released a bundle of about 1,000 games on racial justice and equality. It raised more than $8 million, and all proceeds were donated to non-profit organizations against racial injustice. I recently saw this charity organization, Blood Cancer, recruiting players to raise funds for the charity by playing games. Educational games such as West Atlantis and River City have been used with students to support their scientific identity and encourage social action and community participation for solving environmental problems. Certainly, not all games are effective. Not all games are successful in helping all children learn, support their scientific identities, their social skills, critical thinking, raise their awareness and empathy. Games are part of a system where other elements, such as individual and situational characteristics, factor into the learning outcomes. It is important that the game is well designed, although there is no specific recipe for that. The narrative and the mechanics have to clearly and consistently convey the message of the game. It has to be easy to understand and maybe challenging to master. There is a huge bibliography on game design principles for learning. And then the game has to be appropriate for the students, appropriate for their age, for their interests, for their previous digital and games expertise. If the students don't like action games, then an action game on chemistry will be less likely to engage them and help them learn. And then there are the situational factors, the settings where the gameplay takes place. And we'll talk about the classroom a bit later, but what happens in formal learning settings when a child plays a biology game at home alone? Do they learn something? And if so, what do they learn? How is the knowledge assessed? They may end up with misconceptions about the learning content or miss the learning goals entirely and mainly focus on finding ways to beat the game without actually realizing the meaning behind their actions and the game elements. their relation to the learning content of the game. This actually taps into digital games literacy. Game literacy, like any other literacy, mathematics literacy, language literacy, music literacy, involves not only the skills and knowledge to play a game, to recognize its representations and conventions, simply reading the text, but advanced game literacy skills involve critical thinking about the game, the ability to analyze, decode, understand and interpret its meanings, the ability to situate the game within the social and cultural context and understand its relation to the culture and society it was produced in. Similarly to the written text, where we ask who wrote the text, what is its meaning, why was it written, where was it written, how is it situated in time and place, politically and socially. In a similar way, we can start by asking or discussing with our students who made this game, when, why, in which social, political, and cultural context was it created. And then try to go a bit deeper and try to think and discuss what role do I play in the game? What is the point of view of the game? Does the game guide me linearly, or does it provide me with a space of possibilities where I can explore and experiment? What options does the game give me? What options doesn't give me? What can I do and what can't I do? What are the consequences of each action? How does the game respond? If I destroy a forest, for example, does the game reward me? Does it punish me? Does it do nothing? What questions does the game ask? And what questions it doesn't ask? Why do I kill these people, for example? How are genders represented in the game? How are minorities or other nationalities are represented? By asking such questions, we and our students can think about the game more critically. We can use the games not only as tools for learning, but also as tools for examining broader issues of our culture and our society, and understand the messages emerging from each game. That's because no matter how much experience the children have with games, this doesn't necessarily mean that they can think critically about them. Games are in their everyday life, and it's essential that they are equipped to understand and critique them. And that's actually where the role of the teachers, the educators, is important. In formal education settings, in the classroom, the teachers can use the game as a tool in the framework of accompanying and complementary learning activities. They can discuss and reflect with the students about the game, see what their interpretations, the students' interpretations of the game were, compare the game world with the real world. How is the situation or the issue represented in the game different than from real life? Of course, this requires additional skill sets by the teachers and also additional support for the teachers. Games relevant to the curriculum, lesson plans, appropriate infrastructure, computers, good internet connections, a comfortable space where the students can play the games, available time. Some examples of games that we developed at the Institute of Digital Games, which are appropriate for the classroom as well. First of all, Curio. It's actually a project where Stefano participates in. It's a real-time multi-user classroom games where the players answer questions and also formulate new questions. It includes a teaching toolkit as well, where the teachers can introduce new concepts and new content. It's actually a game for primary students to stimulate scientific curiosity. The envisaged virtual labs, we have 2 online virtual labs, the wind energy lab and the chemistry lab, where the students have to accomplish a number of different tasks, such as naming a molecule's formula, or building molecules, or using a wind farm to power a small town with energy. The Iconoscope game, which is a game about creativity. Players are motivated to creatively interpret concepts as icons. The players create ambiguous icons that represent a concept, and the other players are trying to guess what the concept behind the icon is. Village Voices is a game with collaboration, sharing and helping each other, but also spreading rumors and stealing resources. So it's actually a game about argumentation and conflict management. Another way to encourage game literacy, critical thinking and creativity of the children is by not only playing games, but also by creating games. There are a lot of tools available. Game design and development has been democratized. Students and teachers can use tools such as Scratch, Twine, Construct, GameStar Mechanic to build their own games. And there are actually a lot of events, workshops, game jams, after-school programs where children can create their own games. With the preschool education department of the University of Athens, we did the participatory game design activity with preschool children, which was challenging, but even preschool children had some experience and ideas about digital games. And also at the Institute of Digital Games, we are now running the Global Game Jam Next for Malta for the 2nd year. It's online this year. It's online this year. Where the children aged 12 to 17 learn how to create games, how to design games, and they actually create their own game as well based on a given theme each year. So my takeaway from this presentation is that games are so versatile and dynamic tools. They can be used as learning tools and as tools to think about our world, or as media to express our ideas and messages. We just have to be aware of all the factors involved in the game experience, which are the game itself, the players and their backgrounds, and of course the setting. That's all from me. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Hiro. There's a question which has come in from Julius, I think, which says, in which context can lecturers make use of games as training methods, but specifically in terms of the TVET context and TVET courses? Okay, so that's the first question.
In which context? To be honest, it's difficult to answer this question because it depends on what we want to achieve with our students, what is our learning goal, and whether or not there is an appropriate game available. Definitely, if we decide to use a game in a specific situation, we have to design to do activities, accompanying activities. I don't think we should only rely on the game. So games are very good at stimulating the interest in a topic, introduce the students in the topic, but then I think additional work is required. So I think it depends on the setting.
Maybe I can just follow up on that. I think in the, the TVET context, meaning, technical vocational education and training, I think it, we can argue that it links back to the question that Stefano responded to around history and that, the discipline-based context. I think that the specific question was around, in very sort of simple terms, is that have you come across any kinds of games that might be utilized in the TVET sector? And if not, what might be a good starting point to perhaps think about how that might be implemented, designed, etc.
So how do you find games? How do you come across games?
Well, I think specifically, so the question was around the TVET sector. And again, it links to disciplines in general, whether it's TVET, whether it's history as was proposed before, arts, computer science, we can go on and on and on around the disciplines. But if we go back to the TVET context, have you come across anything about gaming in the TVET space, which is often, well, I'll leave it at that. Yeah.
I don't know. I find that for educators, finding the games they want is difficult. There are a lot of resources available, but it's not always easy to go through them and find the exact game you want for the exact learning objective you want. Now, for certain disciplines, it's more easy. It's easier. So if you work in physics, for example, and you type physics games, you find a lot of resources, a lot of repositories.
I think that's one observation I want to make, which is related to the issue of critical thinking, which was pretty much, the background of Stefano's part. And I think when Iro mentioned, and she said, just because young people are the so-called digital natives, are used to playing games all the time. Okay, and by the way, the whole thing about digital natives is very problematic. It's something which I actually reject. Okay, but this whole thing is just, that doesn't mean that they're necessarily problem solvers. I think it's the word to use. Okay, so, and that's where you said the role of teachers is absolutely vital. So I'm assuming a lot of people who are listening now are from within the teaching community, and I think that's the challenge. I think we now all have. How do we get out of what we're comfortable with as educators to engage with these tools? And the second question, I think it's both to you and Stefano, knowing that the world is not going to go back to the way it was, whether we like it or not, in a big rush. Okay, so in the same way that in previous weeks we're saying we're not going to go back to teaching 100 people all in a class, which means that we're all going to have to be using this to teach, and video is absolutely essential, but games would also be essential. How are we going to navigate this? Do you guys have any ideas how to get teachers to upscale their skills in terms of becoming, helping people become critical thinkers, I guess?
Well, for me, I think the problem is not that the teachers don't want to use games. I think most of the teachers are eager to use games. But I think they find a lot of practical problems, like where to find games, like we said before, how to run the games in the classroom without needing a whole technical team behind them. I mean, if you read the research, in most of the cases, the researchers go and help the educators set up the course, and they talk to the students and they collect data. After the researchers leave, I don't think, even though they probably find it very interesting, the teachers, I don't think they are very willing to do that alone. So, I mean, even having the right computers, I mean, it's a very common thing that educational games are developed, and when there is an update in a driver, in a graphics card, the game does not work. So, I mean, even the technical problems, they're fundamental, I think, for allowing the students to use the games. And then the accompanying material, I mean, helps teachers with lesson plans, develop communities of teachers to exchange their ideas and know-how. So yeah, for me, it is necessary to solve certain low-level practical problems for helping the teachers actually use the games in the classrooms.
Okay, there are two, I believe that games should be used as an enhancement to the teaching which is being conducted. Some students learn more when playing games, while others tend to be more traditional. While at the same time saying the school infrastructure does not always allow for this amount of flexibility. Even during COVID, some parents encountered the problem of not having enough devices in the home. And this was an issue related to the digital divide, I guess. So I don't know how we bridge this.
Exactly, I agree. Games alone, I mean, it's my field. I love games. My expertise is game-based learning. But I'm an educator. My background is in education. So I definitely think that the games should be situated in a framework of other activities as well, reflection, discussion, based on the game, prior to the game or after the game. So as to be able to provide the differentiated required, appropriate teaching for all the needs of all the students. So yeah, a combination of practices together with the games, I think.
I'm going to encourage either people to post more questions, maybe even in the chat box if they don't want to post them in the Q&A, because I think we've exhausted the Q&A ones. I think this idea of bridging, I think, you know, universities always claim to be interdisciplinary, but I've had, you know, my experience of it is that academics are normally very happy to stay cocooned in their own little ivory towers. And it seems to me that games are one way of getting out of that ivory tower. At the same time, I think I'm going to go back to something which Stefano said, which is this idea that, and I think in a way it's the unfortunate name of games, gaming, gambling, equated to being a waste of time sometimes. And that kind of feeds into, you know, our kind of, again, the various disciplines we're in, but also what parents are used to know. That's, I mean, the whole idea now that we've gone from a very traditional way of teaching to screens, to iPads, to keep your kid, you know, shut up, you know, the whole, you know, idea of put an iPad in front of a kid and it will stop crying, I guess. No, that's one of the most, to social media being a waste of time, to the internet being a waste of time, is Google making us stupid? And that takes us into my kind of world, I guess. So this is the kind of things I just want to plonk to you, and how do we get around this? Because that's why I started by saying I see this as a big lacuna in my own education, and yet COVID, if nothing, COVID is really, you know, accelerating the need for me to upskill my game if I want to remain relevant as an educator. So,
can I try?
Sure, you please do dive in.
Think about when writing was introduced in Greek culture. You know, the kind of answer to this new technology of communicating thought was, oh, this is awful, this will make us forget everything that we know, to hell with these books. The real knowledge is when it's internalized in your memory and you know it by heart, right? There was a knowledge that was outside, there was books, it was not good, and by heart, there was positive. I think that many of your worries, including the bad reputation of the word game, comes from the fact that we are perhaps an early generation of adopting this technology to do a certain amount of things. Writing was used initially to keep count, normally for bank loans and so on and so forth. But we discovered later that we could use it for novels, for reflecting on human values, and for a number of other things that had nothing to do with counting, right? Or with keeping track of something, or to remember something. So if we continue with that analogy, then perhaps it will take time for us to understand what virtual worlds are good at, and that they already are, and they will be more in the future, constitutive to our culture. So I think it's something that will come with time, but it's pretty normal that when technologies are early adopted, they are normally taken with diffidence, with a lot of criticism. And well, I think it's just a matter of the historicity of us being exposed to this kind of computer interactions in a number of social situations, rather than them being suitable or not suitable. Iro?
I'm sorry, I was reading some of the questions in the chat, and I just, one of them caught my eye about how do you define a digital game? And caught my eye because it's actually, we talk about this topic in the first session of the courses I teach at the University of Athens. It's an education department. So most of the students, they come to the courses about game-based learning mainly with no prior experience with games, or with these perceptions that games are points, levels, rewards, and occasionally just a waste of time, just something to pass your time. And it's nice because when they, by the time they complete the course, postgraduate or undergraduate, they share with us that they found out a different aspect of games, that games are not only rewards and progressing the levels, but there are games about empathy, like, for example, the game Stefano talked about. So in the first class, we start discussing what a game is. I usually start the discussion by giving them a spoiler. Look, the discussion is not going to end anywhere. We are never going to define exactly what a game is. Because there is no global definition. And I think Paolo Pedrozzini from All Industria, he made a site which generated automatically definitions of different definitions of games. So defining a game, well, how I usually approach it with my students is that it's more meaningful to discuss what game elements does an environment have. So yeah, and I think the definition of game is more useful when you're a researcher, when you want to start from a specific theoretical background. So then you choose one of the definitions of games proposed. And for each element of the definition, there is usually, there are exclusions to the rule. We say, for example, that one of the main characteristics of games is the goal. There is an end goal. But what about Sims? What about SimCity? There is no end to this game. Multiplayer games, there is no ending goal there. We talk about interactivity and that the players, there is a high degree of interactivity in the games. But what about in games interactive stories? There are a lot of games like that, where the player is guided linearly in the game environment and is actually given very few choices because of specific reasons, because the game wants to convey something. So because there is a low degree of interactivity, I think there was a game, I can't remember the name, where you just had to click, just one click. But you had to think when to click. So, yeah.
Okay, maybe we could just cut this a little shorter by letting the question know that there is a field of study that focuses on game definitions, ontology, player reaction, player experience, and it's called game studies. It's been around since 1997, and there's a few thousand researchers in this field in the world, and I already sent him a link to a couple of journals that he can, because he was also asking where the scientific discourse can be referenced. So you're completely right, there's not one single definition, but there's a lot of humanities and scientific discourse that is going on, and he can certainly plug into game studies.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know if this addresses Benjamin's question as well. You know, the point was difference, games versus interaction. I guess I think that kind of places it. I actually think that we're trying to find this common language that vaguely different disciplines can understand each other. I mean, at one stage here I was talking about social skills. That's something which means something to some people. 21st century skills, that's another thing. The OECD has written lots of reports about this. And critical thinking is always behind it, by the way. And then a lot of people kind of say, okay, well, you've got all of these skill sets you're supposed to have as a human being. Think of the TVET sector, yeah? You're supposed to go to a university, you know, get to wear a funny hat because you've spent 4 years over there, and then go and get the job of your dreams, right? And yet there's a lot of skill sets which nobody ever teaches us, you know, being able to communicate, to present. I mean, I think one of the things which really impressed me as soon as the COVID pandemic happened, how visual, I mean, all the cartoonists had a field day. Did you notice that? And how many people started making little videos that because in a way the word wasn't enough to express this moment that we're going through. So people started to manufacture almost their own worlds to explain the strange territory that we're all in, that this is the normal, right? But we're also, you know, I think the most important thing normally is, have you muted your mic? Okay, it's almost like new things and new languages we're getting into. That's all new games that I think might be more appropriate to describe this moment. So I think this idea of games in a social context, and when our social context is really changing radically, I think it's something which I'm particularly interested in exploring with our center. And I think I still think it's an amazing way of bridging with, you know, younger people who sometimes get it. I mean, get it more than that. You know, I mean, when people start looking at me sometimes, and I'm teaching a first year class on social media and digital literacy, they kind of look at you and say, you're still talking about, I know, people's selfie cultures and things like that. We've moved beyond that now. The TikTok generation has moved beyond that now. They are manufacturing their own stories, by the way, on TikTok now as well. So anyway, I mean, that's like my little stone in the puddle, you know. I think in a way, I feel that things are going to accelerate more, not less, because of this moment that we're living in, as we all grasp these tools that we have around us to try and make sense of what the hell is happening. There's a question here, I think.
There's a comment.
Gavspec.com, holograms becoming more popular and implemented in hotels, now more on demand. My interest is strictly conveying thoughts in holograms, as some people see thoughts appearing as perfectly formed holograms. This would allow anyone to experience another world. Yeah, I mean that's another thing, isn't it? Holograms. I mean, just to think of something crazy that I'm very uncomfortable about. I'm old enough, for example, to remember people have died, and you know, like the Freddie Mercury's of this world. The idea of Queen going on tour, for instance, and having holograms of Freddie Mercury is something which makes me nervous. Having been one of the few people to actually watch Freddie Mercury live, and you kind of think, is this a good thing or a bad thing? So even the morality of these things are something we're going to need to grapple with, you know, in the same way that we started to grapple with Facebook now, having more people on Facebook have died, and people using Facebook almost as shrines for people who, you know, it's a way of interacting with people who have gone away. I don't know if this is too loopy for you, but.
Well, we're nearing the end. I think one question I wanted to just raise before we wrap up is to both Iro and to Stefano. Iro, you mentioned this as in terms of, and Stefano in a bigger picture, but Iro, you mentioned specifically around representation in games. And, you know, I think a lot of us would assume, you know, upon reflection, that a lot of games out there refer or sort of cater to a certain kind of audience. And the more competitive games, more of a young male audience. And increasingly there's issues around, I guess you could say, better representation societally. In the past couple of months, we've seen a lot of, you know, protests around, you know, in broad terms, inequality. And of course, if you distill that down to gaming, which is a multi-billion-dollar industry, education or otherwise, how do you see the gaming industry changing, both as an industry around the competitive side, but also in an educational context?
This is a huge question.
Well, I mean, I know let's, as far as we can get in a couple of minutes, perhaps a few tidbits of information or your insights.
Very briefly, it is bad. It is bad. It's getting better.
Yeah.
Getting better. Why would you say
my
that?
idea, my perception as well.
You mean more inclusivity? There's more than just sort of white heterosexual males are designing games now.
Yeah, there's a push for inclusivity, for the games industry starting to resemble other industries instead of living of this exceptionality that relies on the fact that it's entertainment and it's in a way the fulfillment of a childish dream that you might be having. So it's being quite exploitative, not only on the player side, also on the player side, but also from the point of view of who makes these games. And many of these questions of inequality and also gender issues and also abuse have been emerging in the past months. You can already start seeing that also reflecting on the contents of games, which are starting to include more openly homosexual relationship, people in transition or already being transgender, people being able to discuss sensitive topics such as rape, depression, and so on and so forth, which are a clear signal not only that the medium is becoming more aware of its cultural relevance, but also the fact that, as Iro was saying, some tools have quote unquote democratized game development, meaning that anybody who has enough spare time, enough technology to put a game together now can put a game together, including people that were previously disenfranchised or didn't have the technical skills or the education or the venue to present their games to. So it's a change that is both social and it's happening also on the technological level and from the point of view of content. It's going to be a slow process, but it's definitely happening. And I think even people who are not into gaming, like I presume yourself, Kirk, have started to notice that cultural discourse has started to include gaming and the games industry in its functioning. So that's the short answer. Sorry for being so long.
Iro, would you want to add anything to Stefano's
I totally
remarks?
agree. The industry is getting more aware. Players are getting more aware about issues of representation and equality, and they start demanding more relevant content. So yeah, I mean, yesterday I was watching the Games for Change Festival. It's running these days, and it was amazing how many different areas were represented. People of color, different communities. So yeah, there is more inclusion, I think, and it's going to get better.
I think we're going to wrap up. Thank you for those remarks. Alex, any final thoughts before I'll go to the last few slides of my deck?
No, I mean, I don't know about you guys. I mean, I've enjoyed it because we started with the philosophical side of things, got grounded in examples, and in a way we're pulling back again by looking at the whole social context, and the real world we're living in, and the world is changing very, very quickly. I could bore you about post-truths and lies, and can games help us in this brave new world that we're in? But we'll probably leave that for another one of these things, which I hope that we can do in the future. So, I mean, thank you both, and thank you to Jasper too for helping us organize this. I mean, I enjoyed it. I've made a lot of notes. There's a lot of food for thought. So we'll have side conversations for sure.
So I'm just going to share the last few slides, my PowerPoint deck. Just a quick summary here. You'll see the YouTube links. I'll put those in the chat room in a moment with the last few minutes of our talk. Those email addresses as well, I'll repost those. Our panelists, Iro, Stefano, and of course, Alex and myself. And then just a sort of overview, we've done a few webinars. We're concluding now our third. The previous two are there on the side on the left. You can certainly email myself if you have any questions about these. These are also forthcoming in terms of uploading to the YouTube channel as videos. And then the last, of course, I need to plug our last webinar in this series on blockchain and gaming and education. The fourth is coming up next week, July 23rd. And I'll also post that in the chat in a moment. It's also on my LinkedIn profile. So I just want to leave it there. There's the summary. It's going to be Professor John Domingue from the Open University, again, July 23rd, same time next week. But again, want to thank my colleagues, both Iro and Stefano, for a very stimulating presentation from each of you. Of course, Jasper for supporting the tech side, and of course, Alex, as always, my partner on this, and the great facilitation. So I wish you all a good rest of your day wherever you are in the world,